Athens 2007. AC Milan arrive for the Champions League final. On paper it's revenge. In reality, it's a last rite. Paolo Maldini leads Milan out for his 8th European Cup final. To most people, this is a dad's army about to be overrun by Rafa Benitez's pressing machine. Instead, Milan do what Milan have always done in Europe. They controlled the final. Maldini lifted the trophy, and for a moment, it felt like confirmation that the old power still runs this competition. But that night didn't start a new era. It buried an old one. Since Athens, Milan haven't added another Champions League. They've only won Serie A twice. The 7-time kings of Europe have drifted from superclub to financial project. This is the story of how AC Milan went from defining European nights to wondering if they'd ever get back. The modern Milan begins in November 2001. The club was in flux after sacking Faith Tarim, following a poor run of results. In came club legend Carlo Ancelotti, the man who would define the last great era of AC Milan. He inherited a side that had struggled for consistency since the '99 Scudetto. At Milan, a trophy was never enough. He had to win with style. In his first partial season, Ancelotti steadied the ship, finished 4th in Serie A, a return to the Champions League and a UEFA Cup semi-final. Respectable, but the real revolution was happening in his head. The 2002-03 season began with tension. Silvio Berlusconi complained that Ancelotti was too defensive. He demanded flair, but Ancelotti knew that flair needed a foundation. His answer was simple, a radical idea that bent Italian football around it. Andrea Pirlo, a drifting, misused number 10, was dropped deep. From in front of the back line, Pirlo became a deep-lying playmaker, dictating the rhythm of entire matches. Behind him, Dida, once remembered for high-profile errors, quietly emerged as a world-class goalkeeper, and in front of them, Ancelotti built a legendary midfield. Pirlo, Rui Costa and later Rivaldo could coexist, protected by the relentless Gattuso. It was a system that combined cruelty and elegance. Win the ball, give it to Pirlo, let him conduct. The impact was immediate. In 2003, Milan conquered Europe, beating Juventus at Old Trafford in a Champions League final that confirmed their return to the top of world football. They added the Coppa Italia the same year, proving they could grind through every competition. The 2003-04 season brought a young Brazilian magician, Kaká, who looked like he'd been designed in a lab for the team. His pace, timing and vision slipped effortlessly into a side that already had Cafu, Nesta, Maldini and Costa Curta at the back. Milan became a juggernaut, winning the 2004 Scudetto with a then record 82 points. Shevchenko hit his peak, finishing as Serie A's top scorer. They looked untouchable, but even at their height there were cracks. The collapse against Deportivo in the Champions League, throwing away a 4-1 first leg lead, showed that this high-wire act needed perfect execution. When it slipped, they could implode as spectacularly as they dominated. Under Ancelotti, Milan stayed a constant presence at the sharp end of Europe. Domestically, they were often runners-up to a Juventus side later dragged into the Calciopoli scandal. The 2004-05 season was defined by Istanbul, a 3-0 lead, a 6-minute blackout, and a lost final to Liverpool. For most clubs, that's a scar you never recover from. But Milan carried it and kept going. When Shevchenko left in 2006, Ancelotti had to reimagine everything again. Out came the Christmas tree formation with Clarence Seedorf and Kaká behind a lone striker, often Filippo Inzaghi. In midfield, Pirlo, Gattuso and Massimo Ambrosini formed a balanced trio that controlled games through sheer technical authority and work rate. Redemption finally came in 2007, starting the season with an 8-point deduction for Calciopoli. Ancelotti funneled the club's entire energy into Europe. In Athens against Liverpool again, there was no repeat of Istanbul. 2 Inzaghi goals delivered Milan's 7th European Cup. A few months later, the Club World Cup made Ancelotti the first manager to win the trophy with a European side. This was the peak of his era. Then the decline began to show. The legs got heavier, the squad got thinner. By 2009, after a third-place finish and a UEFA Cup disappointment, Ancelotti walked away. Across 423 games, second only to Nerio Rocco, he'd given Milan their last era of real stability, and his departure opened the door to a decade of chaos. At first, the post-Ancelotti years looked almost reassuring. Massimo Allegri arrived and won the 2010-11 Scudetto, with a squad that felt like a last dance for several icons. With Zlatan Ibrahimovic and Thiago Silva in their prime, Milan looked capable of stretching out their dominance. But football's finances were changing. Berlusconi, whose money had powered Milan for decades, was no longer willing or able to keep pace. The summer of 2012 became the moment that everything turned. Milan had sold both Ibrahimovic and Thiago Silva to PSG. In one window, they stepped down from predator to prey. From that decision grew what fans now call the banter era. Between 2014 and 2019, Milan failed to finish in the top four for 5 straight seasons. The club became a managerial graveyard. Legends like Seedorf, Inzaghi, Gattuso were thrown into the dugout with grand rhetoric and no coherent backing. The squad turned into a patchwork of free transfers and mid-table signings. Players who wore the shirt but rarely seemed to fit it. The nadir came in 2014-15 when Milan finished 10th in Serie A, a position that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The old identity wasn't just fading, it was being overwritten by mediocrity. Off the pitch, things got worse. In 2017, Berlusconi finally sold the club to a Chinese consortium led by Li Yonghong. For a moment, it looked like a rebirth. Over €190 million spent in a single summer on players like Bonucci and Andre Silva, and big promises about returning to the Champions League. But the money was borrowed. The plan was fragile. When Li failed to repay a loan to the American hedge fund Elliott Management, the mask slipped. Elliott took control. AC Milan, 7-time champions of Europe, had become a distressed asset on a balance sheet, shuffled around in a financial restructuring game. This wasn't a rebirth, it was the empire's funeral. Under Elliott management, Milan finally found something they hadn't had in years: stability. Stefano Pioli arrived late in 2019 as a stopgap after the Marco Giampaolo disaster, and refused to leave quietly. What began as a manager bounce hardened into a genuine revival. The return of Zlatan in a leadership role gave a young, brittle squad the arrogance and confidence it had been missing. Around him, a new core took shape: Theo Hernandez, Rafael Leao, Fikayo Tomori. By 2020-21, AC Milan were back in the Champions League for the first time in 7 years, after finishing second in Serie A. But the peak came the following year, when Pioli did what many thought was impossible, winning Milan's 19th Scudetto with a club record 86 points. It felt like coaching, cohesion and sheer willpower had dragged the club out of the mud. The title parades in Milan weren't just celebrations, they were an exorcism. For a moment it seemed that the banter era was dead. But the success was fragile. When Pioli rebuilt the culture on the pitch, the boardroom was already preparing for its next reset. In July 22, Redbird Capital bought the club for $1.3 billion, ushering in a new corporate chapter that promised data, sustainability and growth, and quietly put the old Milan soul up for review. The cracks appeared quickly. The following season, Milan failed to defend their title, finishing 20 points behind a resurgent Napoli. A Champions League semi-final run couldn't hide how inconsistent they'd become in Serie A. Tensions between the old guard and the new owners finally snapped in June 23, when Maldini, now a technical director, was abruptly sacked. Maldini had pushed for more investment and openly questioned the club's direction. For Jerry Cardinale's regime, that made him a problem. For the fans, his dismissal felt like treason, the clearest signal yet that history, identity and romance were being sacrificed to a cold, analytical future. Milan were back at the top of the table, but the club that sat there no longer looked or felt like the empire that once ruled Europe. The Redbird era has been defined by a basic misunderstanding of what makes AC Milan work. Cardinale's claim that Italian football fans wrongly believe they own the club revealed the chasm between American investors and the Milanese ultras. Since Maldini's exit, Milan have doubled down on a model run by spreadsheets, with Giorgio Fulani and Jeffrey Moncada front and centre. On paper it looks impressive, rising commercial revenue, the first profits in decades. a club transformed into a clean, investable asset. On the pitch, though, the needle has barely moved. Recruitment after Maldini turned into a series of expensive punts. Milan cycled through strikers like Luka Jovic, Tammy Abraham, and Alvaro Morata, searching for a finisher worthy of a title-chasing side. Piole's sacking and the appointment of Paulo Fonseca only deepened the discontent. Fonseca never truly owned the dressing room, and one moment that defined his tenure, a touchline water break where Rafael Leao and Theo Hernandez stood apart, ignoring their coach's instructions while he talked to empty air. That image of the two stars staring into space became the perfect snapshot of a club that had lost its hierarchy and identity. The chaos spread upstairs. Ibrahimovic's return as a senior advisor looked to many more like a branding play than a clear sporting decision. His public insistence that he was the boss clashed with the reality of the club's structure and muddied who was actually in charge. Then came the left field appointments. Jovan Kirovski to run the youth project, which ended with the under-23 side being relegated. For a club that once set the standard for professionalism, these choices made it feel like Milan were being run as a content portfolio first and a football team second. This wasn't evolution, it was demolition, stripping away everything that made Milan Milan, and leaving spreadsheets where the soul used to live. Paradoxically, as Milan have stumbled on the pitch, their balance sheet has started to look like the Berlusconi glory years. Under Redbird, the club has become a case study in economic efficiency, one of the lowest wage bills among Europe's elite. The sale of Sandro Tonali to Newcastle for €70 million was a gut punch for supporters. The local boy sacrificed at the altar of the spreadsheet, but for the ownership it was pure profit and textbook squad recycling. The problem is what that model turns you into. By prioritising high resale value assets over established winners, Milan have locked themselves into a permanent rebuild. They're no longer hunting in the same market as Real Madrid or Manchester City. They're scanning for the next player they can flip in 3 years' time. The result is a squad full of talent but light on experience, missing the veteran leadership and winning DNA that ran through Ancelotti's dressing room. The club that once collected Ballon d'Or contenders now talks about upside and asset value. Off the pitch, the story is all about growth, commercial deals up, global brands sharpened, and the San Donato Stadium project framed as the key to long-term survival. For the accountants, that's a triumph. For fans watching the team finish 20 points behind Inter, it feels like a trade-off they never agreed to. The Manchester United comparisons write themselves, a historic super club with a huge global following, leveraged as a brand more than a sporting project. The central tension of the Redbird era is right there, commercial success versus sporting drift. A club that defines itself by winning 7 European Cups, being financially stable while flirting with 8th in Serie A isn't a win. Milan have never been a case study in efficiency. At their best, they were an empire. And empires don't exist to impress the balance sheets. Going back to Allegri is less a bold new plan, and more an appeal to muscle memory. He knows the pressure of the San Siro, and he has the medals to prove it. But the squad he inherits bears little resemblance to the one he led to the title in 2011. Rumours around Rafael Leao and Theo Hernandez suggest that a transition season could very quickly turn into a full-blown fire sale. Christian Pulisic has been one of the few consistent bright spots, but there's a limit to how much one player can drag a drifting institution. The 24-25 season is a crossroads. No European football, a furious fan base, and an ownership group that has burned through its margin for error. They can't afford another year of drift. A proven striker remains an obvious short-term fix, with Santiago Jimenez the latest name tasked with leading the line. But forwards don't cure identity crises. Milan needs something bigger. A shared vision that connects the data-driven boardroom with supporters who still see the club as a living, breathing symbol, not an entry on a balance sheet. Right now, AC Milan sit in limbo, suspended between a glorious past and a corporate future they haven't learned to inhabit. The Berlusconi years and Ancelotti's tactical brilliance already feel like black and white footage. The San Siro still towers as a monument to all that history, but without a rediscovered soul, it risks becoming a cathedral of ghosts. On the horizon, the new stadium is both a lifeline and a threat. It could finally close the revenue gap to Europe's elite, but would also mean walking away from the physical heart of the club's identity. That dilemma is the perfect example of modern Milan. To survive tomorrow, they may have to let go of the things that made them legendary. The fall of Milan is a warning shot to every giant. Success is never permanent, and history doesn't win games. From Sacchi's pressing revolution and Ancelotti's Christmas tree, to Redbird's data, this club has lived through extremes of dominance and dysfunction. And whether AC Milan claw their way back to the summit, or remain a polished echo of what they once were, will shape the next decade of Italian football. The giant is sleeping, and in the corporate age, there are no guarantees that it will ever wake up. If you enjoyed part 2 of the story of AC Milan's fall, be sure to check out some of my other Italian videos on the channel, such as Lazio, Parma, and Juventus. If you love retro football, be sure to check out the link in the description to shop retro football shirts from the era. Do you think Milan will ever return to the top? Let us know in the comments below. And in the meantime, stay tuned for more football history, one incredible story at a time.